This month, The Spectator becomes the first magazine in history to print 10,000 issues, and we'd like to celebrate with you. Subscribe to The Spectator for 12 weeks for just £12. Plus, we'll send you a bottle of commemorative Spectator gin, absolutely free. Go to spectator.co.uk/celebrate.
Welcome to a rather unusual Spectator podcast. I'm Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator, and during the lockdown we're asking our writers to read their articles. Normally when we print the magazine, it is shared by our subscribers with their friends and family, so you might get Matthew Parris' column, for example, read 3 or 4 times for every one time it's printed. This sharing is rather harder to do during the lockdown, so we've asked Matthew Parris, Toby Young and Isabel Hardman to read out their articles for this week's magazine. First is Matthew. He's talking about this strange trend. While anybody talking about the coronavirus basically thinks that everything is vindicated, whatever it was they thought in the first place.
There must be a quote from Shakespeare for this, but so far I haven't found it. It's the way we all of us contrive to see in cosmic events the evidence, the signs and portents for what we already believed even before the cataclysm had occurred. These are the days of miracle and wonder, sang Paul Simon, the way we look to a distant constellation that's dying in the corner of the sky. These are the days of miracle and wonder, and don't cry, baby. Don't cry, don't cry. Somehow there never was a plague, earthquake, flood or epidemic that was not also a sign that the human race must mend its ways according to wisdom we had long recommended, even during less extraordinary times. One fine day, perhaps something remarkable and strange may happen that causes us to review, even horrors abandon, a dearly held belief. But not yet, baby, not yet, not yet. Not we of the print and broadcast commentariat, anyway. And I hasten to say this starts with your columnist, at least as guilty as any one of my journalistic brethren. There was a sort of inevitability about my take on the latest emergency. You'd have guessed, wouldn't you, that your predictably and sometimes tediously contrarian columnist, ever anxious to take a sidekick at Boris Johnson's government, would find a way of representing this pandemic as overhyped. And your columnist, this hurts even to type it, may be wrong. But so could others. So, chuckling this Easter weekend as I listened to the Archbishop of Canterbury remind his flock of the eternal Christian truths and values that COVID-19 is bringing home to an anxious nation, I made a little list of other familiar voices in our media, respected, every one of them, and rightly so, but very various in the opinions they publish, and each with his or her own slant on a submicroscopic little virus that any objective observer surely would describe in the same way. So I plucked from the air a dozen or so names. First I thought, let's guess how each will recruit the coronavirus pandemic to the particular bees in each bonnet. Then, having guessed, let's see what they actually did say. A word though first. I'm not implying any of them is wrong. With many I agree, with all I sympathise. We each have our particular shtick and we write accordingly. I don't mock maybe just a little bit, but I mock myself too. And I smile at the dexterity with which this miserable pandemic can be bent to the surface of so many conflicting opinions. Now take Polly Toynbee. Polly believes in the power of the benevolent and well-funded state. Grad-grind Tory governments are her bête noire. As this pandemic peaks, she writes, the NHS and social care are brutally worn down by a decade of needless, ideologically driven austerity. Our stripped-down NHS will not be able to cope. But from the other side, the Spectator's Charles Moore sees the NHS as an inefficient socialist monolith, as, he believes, COVID-19 has proved. The inflexibility of our lumbering NHS, he writes in The Telegraph, is why the country has had to shut down. Back at The Guardian, where Polly Toynbee was writing, George Monbiot, whose journalism is rooted in a belief that we are wrecking our planet, sees a clear message written in the virus's death statistics. COVID-19 is nature's wake-up call to complacent civilization, he writes. The paper's Simon Jenkins, however, hears a different wake-up call. Simon has been an excellent and tireless champion of localism over the decades. His ears prick up as coronavirus strikes. We need local testing centres, he writes, local food supplies, local elderly care, local employment assistance, above all, local leadership. Over at the Sunday Telegraph, Janet Daly hears in wailing ambulance sirens the call for a different kind of leadership. Boris will be back, she writes. We can give thanks for that. The Mail on Sunday's Dan Hodges hears the same call. Remember the caricature, he writes? Boris was Jeremy Corbyn's part-time PM, and then the country saw the reality. A man who had worked himself into the ground, and then intensive care, in his attempt to keep Britain safe. The Mail on Sunday's Peter Hitchens draws a different lesson from the virus's spread as he laments the Johnson government's stumbling retreat from reason into fear. Mr. Hitchens, a tireless advocate of individual liberty, fears this pandemic is herding us towards a police state. My Times colleagues are absorbed in other matters, attuned to other messages from medical science. Ian Martin, a strong advocate of Brexit, concludes, not without relish, that coronavirus could blow the EU apart. Philip Collins, no fan of Labour's recent expedition into insanity, hopes it will blow Corbynism apart, mocking Corbyn's supporters, who are, he says, so out of touch they believe COVID-19 measures represent a victory for their ideas. Janice Turner, an admirable battler against the trans lobby, notices the virus kills more men than women. How extraordinary that it took COVID-19, she says, to expose the absurdity of an utterly unscientific argument that biological sex is not real but an artificial construct randomly assigned to babies at birth. Meanwhile, The Guardian's Afua Hirsch, much of whose writing has been about the roots and consequences of racism, notices disproportionate deaths in black communities and wonders how come black people are bearing the brunt. But for the broadcaster and writer Justin Webb, a hammer of one particular US presidential bid, COVID-19 has a different target in its sights. Step forward, he writes, Joe Biden. Fill the space. Calm the nerves. Do it daily. Build something of substance. That's the challenge. A low bar to be cleared by a man or woman of any age. But he cannot do it. David Miliband, president of the International Rescue Committee and a campaigner for relief missions, sees a different challenge. The world won't be safe from coronavirus until poor nations get more aid. And finally to our James Delingpole, a writer I first noticed 15 years ago in his wonderful documentary about taking on the hair-raising tobogganist Cresta Run in Switzerland, a testament to the thrill of being scared. Writing now about the pandemic in Die Weltwoche, James laments the tragedy. But what a time to be alive, he adds.
That was Matthew Parris. Next, Isabel Hardman.
Domestic abuse sufferers are the hidden victims of the lockdown, by Isabel Hardman. For years, ministers from successive governments have conducted drills for all kinds of pandemic scenarios, but they never imagined a lockdown. It's a new tool, and its implications and side effects have never been properly tested. So no one really thought about the effect it would have on something like domestic abuse. Before the lockdown, it was estimated that 2 women a week were killed by their current or former partners. But that was when they could move freely. Now, opportunities for escape are scarce. The only time a victim is alone is when their abuser goes to the shop, or if they're allowed out for exercise. The abused women, and they overwhelmingly are women, aren't going into work, and so have little chance to tell colleagues what's going on, or for anyone to spot signs of physical violence. This is another opportunity for the men carrying out these crimes. They stand far less chance of being found out. An awful piece of jargon in the domestic abuse world is zoning. It is when a perpetrator hits their victim only on the parts of the body that the rest of the world doesn't see. Domestic abuse is carried out behind closed doors and under clothes. Women go into work looking perfectly normal, but with bruises and scars all over their torsos, a pattern horribly familiar to those who work in shelters. Michelle Blumson, who runs the East Surrey Domestic Abuse Service, tells me she has spotted a shift in the type of abuse. Perpetrators who haven't used physical violence before are starting to do so now. There's a worrying increase around head and face injuries. They're not bothering to do zoning anymore because no one is going to see the women. There are also now reports of children being abused in a way that they were not when school was still on. Pupils no longer have a safe space to spend time each day, no one to talk to about what's happening at home. Officially, children classed as vulnerable are entitled to go to school in the lockdown, but crucially, there is no obligation for them to do so. Ministers had thought 20% of pupils would keep coming. Less than 2% did so. Of course, only a small minority of children exposed to abuse are recognised by social workers as being at risk. Blunsom and other charity workers struggle to get through to women they try to help in the lockdown because they are rarely alone. We know that survivors really benefit from being directly asked if they are being abused, she says. But now, no professional can directly ask. She tells her colleagues that if they are talking to abused women, they should assume not only that the perpetrator is there, but that the call is taking place on speakerphone. It's wrong to presume that all domestic abuse is physical. In recent years, there has been far wider understanding of the emotional techniques used in coercion, constant criticisms, insults and screaming. Abusers wear their victim down, so that the victim comes to believe that they are as useless as the person they love claims they are. And also, importantly, they come to believe that their abuser is looking after them. A classic example of looking after is controlling the household finances to the point that the victim has no agency of their own, even to buy basics like underwear or groceries, which also limits their ability to run away. Huge advances have been made recently in recognising and tackling this. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, who runs the charity Surviving Economic Abuse, says the lockdown has given abusers an opportunity to grow their system of control. There will be a number of women who have lost their jobs or are furloughed, whose partners are using this as an excuse to say, we should be cutting back on essentials like food, clothing and utilities, to the extent that the money they were saving to run away starts to disappear. Police are doing their best to respond to the rise in incidents. Ministers are aware of the long-term cost of all this. The longer the lockdown goes on for, the more cases there will be, and the harder it will be for specialist services to help, especially if their funding dries up or their staff are quarantined. Some £2 million has been announced for domestic abuse helplines, but this doesn't change the current lack of options for victims once they have found the courage and the safety to dial those numbers. Women's refuges have been oversubscribed for years. Pre-lockdown, an average of around 90 women and the same number of children were being turned away from these secure properties every night because of lack of space. So what to do now? Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, has said the government wants to keep victims in their homes, moving the perpetrators out instead. There will be enough accommodation available, she said. But those on the front line are sceptical that this is really possible. Suzanne Jacob runs Safe Lives, a charity which often has the Home Office's ear on abuse policy. She worries about the end of lockdown when women and children have more freedom to tell others what's happening and to try to escape. This is also the time when a woman is most likely to be murdered. There will come a safeguarding peak, when all of the things that are being suppressed behind closed doors will come out. There's this deep anxiety around what level of service can really be provided then. Other charities agree and ask how they'll manage to pull qualified domestic abuse workers out of thin air. But people are, at least, beginning to notice this. Perhaps one of the very few good things about this lockdown is a greater awareness, which might lead to pressure on government to do more to repair the damage, when women, currently helpless, seek help. The surge in government support for the NHS has shown what can be done when the sense of urgency is great enough. Perhaps it's not too much to hope that when the worst of COVID is over, the indirect victims of the crisis might warrant similar attention.
That was Isabel Hardman. The day before this was published, she was challenging Matt Hancock about this in the press conference, although those of you who will have seen it will have noticed that he wasn't particularly good at giving answers. Anyway, finally, Toby Young.
Stinky Malinky is growing on me. Toby Young. Since the beginning of the lockdown, Caroline has been congratulating herself for having bought a puppy just in time. She doesn't mean it would have been impossible to get one after the 23rd of March, because visiting a breeder is not an essential journey. She means that a puppy is a great source of entertainment as well as solace when you're cooped up in your home, particularly if you have children. It's like having our very own therapy dog. She's a Cavapoo Chon, a cross between a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, a toy poodle, and a Bichon Frise, a handbag dog, in other words. We had an interminable family discussion about what to name her, with the children seemingly engaged in a competition to come up with the most cliched suggestions. Our eldest son, notionally the owner of the dog, wanted to call her Biscuit, or failing that, Cookie. Our 16-year-old daughter wanted to call her Callie, short for Calypso. Why not just call her Chavy and have done with it, I said. The 11-year-old suggested Echo, but thankfully that was ruled out when we discovered another Cavapoo Chon owner, a trendy young man who lives nearby, had named his Echo. He glides along the pavement on his man scooter, with Echo peeping out from a papoose tied to his front. Past the sick bag. In the end, we plumped for Malinky, which means tiny in Czech. Caroline likes it because she's half Czech, and I like it because it means I can call the dog Stinky Malinky. As the person who has to clear up her messes, I've begun to suspect that the poo in her breed name is not a reference to poodle, but to something else. She's like a little factory, capable of manufacturing her body weight in the stuff every 24 hours. The downside of the name Malinky is that the children have shortened it to Marley, which, if pronounced with a long A, is a slang term for a Somalian. For that reason, shouting Marley at the top of your lungs in Acton Park during your once-a-day exercise can be hazardous. I'm constantly hissing at them to pronounce it with a short A. Like most little dogs, Malinky has a habit of running up to big dogs and barking at them. I worry they might eat her. Ooh, Scooby Snack! But she seems to be aware of the danger, because as soon as they take any notice, she immediately rolls over and sticks her paws in the air. Even though it's disappointing to see her surrender so quickly, I dare say it's sensible. For a brief period in New York, I was the owner of a Yorkshire Terrier named Jack. He was originally my girlfriend's dog, but I got custody when we broke up. I loved Jack because he was always picking fights with bigger dogs, and he never backed down, like some pocket-sized Irish brawler. But in the end, it was his undoing. I found a new home for him on a farm upstate, and on the first day he was there, he bit their border collie. She was a battle-hardened working dog, not some namby-pamby city dog. That was the end of Jack. One of the drawbacks of having a dog during this crisis is that they don't stick to the 2-metre rule when you're outside the home. In the park, Caroline and I will scrupulously observe social distancing etiquette, crossing to the other side of the path whenever we see someone coming towards us, but Mally runs up to everyone within a 100-yard radius and begins jumping up and trying to lick them. Inevitably, they start stroking her. What an adorable little thing! And I worry that if they've got corona germs on their hands, they'll transfer them to her, and she will then transfer them to us. Who knows? Dogs could be super spreaders, the reason the death toll is so high, in spite of the lockdown. Whenever I complain about this, Caroline reminds me that I claim to have had the virus, so what am I worried about? Well, yes, probably, but even so. I was the most reluctant member of our household when it came to getting a new pet, having not enjoyed owning our previous dog. Leo was a Hungarian Vizsla, and we had to rehouse him when he bit an Ocado delivery man, and Caroline received a police caution. But Mally is growing on me. She has such a sweet, trusting little face, it's hard not to warm to her. And in truth, watching her become part of the family has made the lockdown more bearable. If only she didn't poo quite so much.
That was Toby Young, and that's the end of our audio selection this week. Please do send us an email on podcasts@spectator.co.uk to let us know what you think of this, the format. We've only done it for 2 or 3 weeks, so anybody you'd like to include on our next issue, please do let us know, either in an email or you can leave a message under the YouTube screen if you're listening to this on YouTube. Our issue next week, by the way, is rather a special one. It's our 10,000th issue. No magazine in the history of publishing in this or any other country has come up with a 10,000th issue, and we've got something pretty special to show you. So for those of you who subscribe to the magazine, look out for it. For those of you who would have bought the magazine in the days where there were shops to sell it, what can I say except, you can buy it online, or maybe there's a supermarket that will sell it or something. It's pretty good, so do look out for it. And also, while I'm here, thank you to you, our subscribers, thank you to our listeners, thank you to our readers for giving us this success and this longevity. It's pretty difficult times for the press right now, but The Spectator is celebrating not just a record number of issues, but a record number of readers. So from us to you, thank you.